And we're live. Ngandu.
Yo, what's up?
What's up? Welcome to the stream of sweat. 1 second. I'm still learning this tool. But this, in theory, can you see us on Twitch?
I do.
You see us as a side-by-side?
I do, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so welcome to the stream of sweat. Let me give you a little introduction. This is our very first show, which is why we're fumbling through the screens, fumbling through the buttons, and not really know what we're doing. But the whole idea behind this show was something Ngandu and I were interested in doing. It is a live stream where we'll watch the results of daily fantasy matches come in. We'll talk about daily fantasy sports and talk about our general approaches for mostly PGA golf and DFS, but also other sports probably to come. Ngandu, you want to tell me a little bit about your background? You want to tell the folks a little bit about what it is you do and how long you've been doing this and where you're kind of coming from in daily fantasy golf?
I am coming from the place of someone that is a huge sports fan, a huge sports fan my whole life, collecting baseball cards. I think when I was a kid, I had as good a command of Major League Baseball statistics as they come. I just remember memorizing statistics and understanding who was the league leader in stolen bases and RBIs and home runs and all that thing. So I've always had an affinity for, for numbers and statistics. Years ago, when this daily fantasy thing first got off, I remember you were the first person that alerted me to this and, called me up, said, hey, this daily fantasy thing's gotten really big. 5, 6, 7 years ago, here we are. In my daytime, I'm a practicing attorney and I work in technology. So there's a lot of crossover in terms of understanding data, understanding how we make decisions, and understanding how we develop frameworks to predict the outcomes of these particular matches. I play golf recreationally, but it wasn't until I got into DFS that I really started watching it and gaining a real understanding of who the players are and tournaments and sort of how everything goes. So I'm looking forward to this process. I certainly won my fair share of tournaments in DFS, but nothing huge. I'm not some big whale. So I'm looking forward to working through this and trying to come up with different ways to uncover value and win some money.
Awesome. And you're Rainmaker on DraftKings.
Rainmaker with one A, because the real way to spell it was already taken. So you can find me on Twitter. You can also find me on DraftKings.
There you go. I come from a similar background. I grew up mostly into sports stats. I'm an awful athlete, and I can't really play anything. I used to golf, but I was so terrible at it, I more or less gave that up. But I did work in pro sport. So I worked for the Pittsburgh Pirates, mostly in the amateur draft. I worked for the Seattle Seahawks, also work in the draft and the advance, more in the data engineering side and data analysis side there. And then the last year, I worked for the Detroit Tigers as a director of data services. And I left there. Now I'm working for a consulting firm in Boston doing data science, predictive modeling. And that kind of opened me up to be able to gamble on sports and do this. So this is kind of the start of this for making this show and kind of doing these models and kind of starting to take a look at this. So as we kind of go through this, some of this is just learning. Like I've played this recreationally, as Ngandu mentioned. Like I started a long time ago, like just playing around with it. Much more on trying to project players and not really understanding how the markets worked and how the really skilled players were actually winning these. It was more recreational, and I lost my money like in 2012 and 2013, and then just kind of lost interest. But then the last year, I started really looking at how you could actually come up with models to predict lineups, and we started to build some of those with some advice from Ngandu, just understanding how professional players do these, how skilled players do these, and just my experience in sports and analytics, and how I might approach these similar problems in business or in in some teams I'd worked for. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. This is all pretty new to me. Like, we do have the game up right now. As this said, this is a stream of sweat. So our models are kind of hosed. Are we swearing on this, or are we? I haven't really talked about
Sure,
that.
why the hell not?
They're kind of fucked. Like, we're totally fucked
Totally
because of the
fucked.
way the my model was ill-equipped to handle the change of things as it happened with the tournament this weekend, and we can talk a little bit about that in a minute. But just generally how I approach models and looking at having data and expecting a certain state when I execute my models, kind of hosty. But we do have some models up. We can screen share where we are right now. I'm gonna only pull up my best model because why would I want to show all my awful ones? But I am winning $30 at the moment, and we can talk a little bit about how where I get data from, my approach to building these models, and kind of contrast that with what you do, Ngandu, which is a little different approach. And it's more probably what most users do, I would imagine, compared to my approach, was probably more data driven and objective. And it's like I don't really know any of these golfers. I hardly watch it, I am kind of learning the how this is done. I kind of just took my approach to how I would build simulations to attack these. So please take that for what it is. But maybe I'll talk a little bit, Nadu, about my approach to building models, and we can kind of talk about how that contrasts with what you do and how you've had success doing fantasy golf. So
Sounds great.
yeah, so mine, as I mentioned, is data driven. I'm trying to build a model that will sort through and identify lineups that I think have high probabilities to win large pools. So that's the approach. So I started with, as you do with all these data science projects, you start with the absolute simplest thing you could think of, just a simple approach, and try to make it basic, and then you can build on it. So that's kind of what we're running in right now. So I started just by collecting some data. I collected a group of projections from the same sites that probably everyone uses, the free ones that are. I want to get the dogs. Great, thanks, son. What an asshole sometimes. The same sites everyone goes and gets them. Like I did pay for a subscription for this to Fantasy Labs. But I also paid for a subscription to Data Golf, and then just some of the free roto sites that allow you to grab projections. So I grabbed all those. I ran those through a Bayesian model to give me an aggregated projection that basically gives me a distribution of how it thinks players will perform. So didn't come up with my own. I just tried to aggregate the ones that were out there that seemed to be pretty efficient and pretty accurate, usable, by basically an understanding of how a player was going to perform. I run those through a simulation. The simulation will create a distribution I run those through. I build every lineup that I can, which is kind of why we're looking at showdowns, because the number of golfers is small. So basically build every reasonable lineup that exists. And then I simulate those by randomly sampling all the golfers from their distribution, and then look at how the lineups performed, and at what frequency that lineup was a winning lineup. And then based on those, I then look at how often an individual golfer is in a winning lineup, and I try to use lineups that meet a similar exposure. Now for this one today, I put in 5 lineups because I didn't have some of the data that I was using to generate these lineups, and the simulation is very slow. So I didn't have time to execute everything because the round 3 didn't complete until like an hour before round 4 started. So I just did the best I could because we wanted to start today and kind of start our stream. But this is what we came up with. That's my general approach. Now, like, the one thing you'll probably notice, and I'm sure Ngandu will kind of talk about his approach, is I don't really look at ownership. I don't really think about I don't really think about what other players are going to do or what strategies they're applying. I literally just try to look and see at what frequency an individual lineup will probably be a winner, and I try to understand that everyone is going to use an optimal exposure, and then I just run with that. And what it should do, in theory, is you'll end up winning when your chalky players perform as expected, and when the few players you picked that were high leverage end up performing well, and that you basically are looking to find the highest probability of that situation for the most part. That's basically what I'm doing and basically how I'm starting. We have a lot of work to do to kind of flesh out this model and make it better and flexible and kind of have it scale to larger pools and bigger tournaments and things like that. But I think it's a cool place to start. I think it is a really interesting problem. And it's going to be kind of a fun journey, kind of talking about some of the challenges I have as I build this and move it along, and kind of talk with Ngandu, and he tell me how stupid I am with some of my assumptions and approaches. So this will be kind of a fun way to go about it, I think.
Yeah, I think it is a fun way to go about it, and I think that your lineup is a really good place to kind of start in terms of our discussion with respect to Showdown. So, for people that are not familiar with Showdown on DraftKings, I would hope if you're watching this video that you are, but if you're not, Showdown on DraftKings is a single round. It's a single round tournament. This particular round is unique within the Showdown um, framework because it includes, so typically with DraftKings, you get points for birdies and eagles and albatross if you happen to get that lucky with the golfer, and then you get dinged for bogeys. But because of the way that the scoring is set up with DraftKings, you actually get dinged a lot less for bogeys than you do birdies. And you also get points for pars as well. And so with Showdown, since there's no placement points, you really focused on trying to find players that are able to score. And so the strategy then what ends up happening a lot of times with these strategies with respect to Showdown in terms of trying to find people that score is you're trying to do one of two things. Ideally, you want to find someone. There's a couple of different golfers that sort of fit that profile within Showdown. They're the golfers that are really good putters. Denny McCarthy is a perfect example of that. He just walked off the front nine and he birdied 7 out of the 9 holes, which is kind of crazy and something that you do not see every week. But his specialty is putting, and he's also very good on a particular type of putting surface, Poa Anna, which is what they're playing in California. It's very popular on the West Coast. And he happens to be, I think, the best Poa putter in the tournament, or one of them. And he's also one of the best putters, period. Because of the nature of putting, and this is something that Josh can probably speak to, most of the time, people that are giving tips on like who to target in a particular golf tournament tend to shy away from putting because there's higher variance and it's less predictive than, say, approach numbers, which are your how well you hit irons, how well you hit your second shot. So anyway, with Showdown, you're trying to find guys that can score. With round 4, there's also placement points for that final round, and so you really do want to focus on a mix of a few players that are in the mix that can, that are going to win, because you really do have to have the winner to win the whole thing. But then you want to kind of sprinkle that in with a few players that can get hot. Maybe you don't get placement points, but they can get hot. And the reason why you want to sprinkle those in is because once you get past third place, the difference in placement points, it amounts to, I can't give you an exact figure off the top of my head, but it's not that much. It's not that much of an edge. And so one common mistake that people make is they focus on getting the guys that are going to place high, and it sort of ends up being to the detriment of other players because you're not making as many points once you get past third place. So
yeah, I think basically the 5 lineups I put in, the one that actually did fine, which is this high floor lineup, is all guys that were at the leaderboard. like you said, I think this is probably an inefficient lineup to actually win large money in these pools. But I'm pulling it up because it's actually in the money. The other ones, I think, as we kind of talked through, are kind of dogs. So it's like Taryn, he just had an awful front nine, and the whole problem is this is halfway through, so these guys are going to play
Right.
9 more holes tomorrow.
Right.
He could get 9 birdies and be awesome. Like it could be a great pick,
Right.
but right now that's kind of how these other ones shook out. Like it was basically looking for
Yeah.
guys that are movers, guys that I thought might that the model thought might play well, and
Yeah.
what's interesting with when you do this data driven approach, it probably the projection for these guys probably didn't move much, even though they were way down the list. So if it thought they were going
Yeah.
to be good on Thursday, it probably still thinks they're going to be good. Like one thing you'll find in particular with Showdown, I would imagine, and again, kind of as a noob here, but I would imagine people lean toward the people that are winning just because they're hot. It's actually fairly highly debated topic in pro sports overall. Is like, does the hot hand exist? Like, is Big
Hmm.
Poppy really clutch? Is that a skill or is he incredibly lucky? I think
Hmm.
I've always kind of settled on the side because you'll find papers that support both. Like, oh, it is statistically a skill. It isn't. I always believe personally that it's kind of a two-part thing. One, there are players that do have this skill that they literally do get hot. They basically they feed on stress. They feed on high leverage situations, and other players don't have the skill, and it's literally indifferent to them. So I think there are certain
Hmm.
players that it does impact. It's hard to identify those. I think you need a large sample to know if they can or can't. It's like field goal kickers. You need such a large sample, like multiple seasons, to know if a kicker is really good just based on the results of kicks. So by the time you know if they were any good, they're too old to want them anymore, really. So it's one of those types of things. It's not a great like success is not a great measure to understand it.
Hmm.
Um, the one thing I would say here though is like it liked these players from the start. It liked Taryn from the beginning of the tournament, so it plugged him in, and then he kind of had a bad front nine here. But it is just kind of interesting how that goes. Like I think just as a human, you want to believe there's a pattern. Like humans love patterns, and they tend to look for them. I personally don't believe in the hot hand. I don't. For most sports, momentum probably isn't really a thing, even though people want to believe that is. So I think that's a spot where I hope these models can excel. And I think it's a spot where I feel like a model like this might excel in, particularly in late tournament showdowns.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in some other, some additional context also, one of the very common strategies that people will attack in Showdown, round one is a little bit different. I think with round one, you're more likely to find more ownership concentrated with the players that people anticipate are going to play well. Once you get past round one, a very common strategy with Showdown is to target players that are that are that have that are playing very well tee to green, so particularly off the tee and hitting approach shots, but are not putting well or putting below expectation. That's a
Mm.
very common strategy that you see is guys will go pull up Data Golf or whomever and look in tournament fantasy national. They'll look in tournament at players that have really high approach numbers, and then they'll look at their putting numbers and they'll say, okay, either A, this guy's not putting very well, or B, this guy is normally a better putter and he should be putting here, so I'm going to target that person. And so um, and that there's a lot of reason for that. There's a lot of sensibility. There's a lot of that makes sense. But then you run into this problem with McCarthy, for example, where he's really not much of an approach player. In fact, he probably loses strokes to the field on approach most tournaments, but he's an elite putter, and it's like you can get hot at any time. So this kind of gets into this whole idea of like this. There's a game theory aspect to this. Like if you know that everyone's thinking, I got to find the hot approach guy. Well, maybe you think differently. I listened to a podcast on Wednesday with Pat Mayo's podcast. He had Totag and Tambo on there, who's a really high level DFS player, and Tambo's view they were actually arguing about a couple of guys. If I remember this correctly, I believe they were arguing about Kurt Kitayama, who's a really good ball striker, but not much of a putter. And they were also arguing over Joseph Bramlett, also, who's really, I think of as kind of a bomber. And I think Mayo was kind of like, yeah, but you don't, driving is not really going to help you on these courses here at AT&T because there's, I think Pebble Beach is one of the shortest courses in the field. And so the idea is, why would I want to play a guy that can bomb it when he doesn't really fit the model for that? And Tampa was like, if you focus on guys that fit this model, for example, it's going to lead you in the same direction as everyone else. And you really need to be thinking about getting different. And he was right about that. Both of these guys have played really well. And even if neither of them win, I think that they have played really well. So, and this kind of gets into this whole concept of what you're talking about, like focusing on players versus focusing on lineups. I would say that for my strategy, I think I've spent too much time focusing on players and less time thinking about the lineup as a whole and how, do I have enough upside in this lineup? Do I have have enough guys in this lineup that can actually win the whole tournament? And in my lineup, do I have too many? Am I getting too cute? Because you're constantly trying to find pivots with ownership. So it's like, am I getting too cute? Am I playing this $6,500 guy for no reason? Well, he's $6,500 for a reason, So that's kind of like there's a lot of give and take here, and I think your view about like thinking about this dispassionately, I think, as I've said to you before, I think can be very valuable because it doesn't lock you into these narratives that everyone else is going to be talking about. There's a reason why ownership gravitates to certain players. It's because everyone's talking about the same thing. Oh, this guy really he bombs it off the tee, So anyway, those are just sort of some of my thoughts in general on this tournament and the tournament as a whole. Last thing I'll say with round 4 and Showdown in general, and this kind of goes into one of the things that you were talking about, is that ownership. It's really hard to find ownership for Showdown. Most people don't even attempt to do it. And I think that if you have some sense of where players are going to gravitate to, you're going to be at an advantage.
How much have you seen ownership change? Like, do you notice it's obviously the last round is different because there are the winner points. Do you notice like a large shift in ownership percentages between round 1 and 3, or does it pretty much?
You can if a guy kind of shits the bed in the first round.
Mm.
A very common thing that I think sharper players will do is like go into, one thing that I think I think this is good advice is guys will say, hey, listen, ignore round 1, just play the guys that you really liked going into this tournament. This tournament is actually even more different because there's 3 different courses.
That
and
also holds my model, by the way. Like, it was very difficult to handicap that.
Right. So there's 3 different courses. In the first 3 days, everyone plays all 3, and then you play Pebble on the last day. And so what has happened for the first 3 tournaments is we all know if you're following this, and if you go to Data Golf, they'll tell you exactly what they estimate the difference in strokes is. It's basically it's Monterey Park is easiest, Pebble Beach is next, and then the hardest has been Spyglass Hill. And I think on Thursday the difference was like 2 strokes on average. I think it played harder. Now there's other reasons for that with weather and all that kind of stuff, but that adds a whole other lineup element to it. I knew guys that didn't even play guys from Spyglass Hill in round 1 of the Showdown. So
yeah, Showdown's tough that way. I think
it is tough.
I underweighted in my basic model. I didn't have for the first 3 rounds when I was looking at it. I didn't have a weighting for these courses, so I assumed it was all the same, and it didn't result well for those because of that. It's like anybody that played the tougher courses was at a huge disadvantage for a single day Showdown. It made it really tough. The weather was also difficult. Like there was a major shift in weather. So that was also disappointing. Those are all things I need to probably incorporate into my model better. Tee times, I know, like just looking at what other people are doing data-wise, including tee times and how weather changes over time, and even like how the greens behave. It can affect players differently as it gets like, drier, as the day gets longer. I don't know how much of an effect it'll really have. I'll look at the data, but yeah, it's
Guys that go off early, a lot of times you're going to get, depending on where the tournament is, a lot of times you're going to get pretty good conditions in the morning,
right.
and the greens are going to be softer and more receptive, more receptive. So yeah, you get a windy day, you got one of the last tee times, you might get, you might be hitting a 150-yard approach shot on to basically concrete, they've been
It's like
they've been dried out.
it's like using an airplane bathroom. You really want to be the first one. Like you don't want to be the guy with like right before they like say, okay, come back, take a seat, turn off your laptop. You don't want to be in that situation. That's a bad moment for you. You want to be like,
I would
you might as well just
I
get
would
as soon
think
as they turn the light on, you get up, you go. Like you don't wait around. Don't if you just try to go. When I worked in Seattle, I used to do a lot of like cross country flights, and like
yeah.
I would literally be like, I'm gonna go the second they turn the light on because I want to be the first person in this bathroom. It's 6 hours. There's like 300 people on this plane. I'm not gonna be the last guy to use that bathroom. So
No,
we'll
you do not. You do not. I mean, to extend the metaphor, even it's almost like going to a concert and being the last guy in like
oh,
being one of the last people in like a porta potty or something like
it's like
that. Oh,
Tiger Stadium in the eighth inning
yes,
back in Mike Henneman's on the mound when you really got to go, like one of those.
you're dating yourself now, Mike Henneman. That's a deep one. That's a deep cut. Yeah. So going back to this tournament, for example, the nice thing about all this is, I believe, this is the last we're going to see of like multiple rotations, because I think this week's AT&T was was rotation, and then the American Express also was multiple locations, and the Farmers was too. There's a north and a south course at Torrey Pines,
Right. Yep.
so
Yep.
we got that going for us. I got that going for me, so we'll see.
What do you think about? And this is something uh, I was looking at. I was looking at how some other, especially folks that first get started and playing at a higher level, how many lineups and at what price points do you generally attack? Like my thought is, like objectively, I need to max it out at a low dollar and kind of grow. Because if I'm really trying to get a good distribution of players, I basically want to reflect the probability that all those players have an opportunity to be in a winning lineup. So I want to make sure my my exposure matches expected outcomes.
Mhm.
So that would mean playing a high number of lineups. Like, how have you done it historically? How have you approached it?
It's a really good question. I've been all over the place. I think that lately my approach has been low dollar amounts. I've been all over the place. I've had a lot of success being all over the place. Um, but I've started kind of all over the place. I think that right now my thought process is I'm trying to focus on low dollar amounts. I'm trying to get more exposure, and so I'm trying to do a mix. I I think what I've been doing lately is playing more cash, and then playing more cash playing more cash because that has helped me think about ownership and think about um, areas to pivot, finding pivot points. So playing more cash, we're playing low dollar cash tournaments, like a dollar, but entering like 50 of them,
Mm,
um, entering double ups, like the super huge double ups,
right.
where there's a ton of entries, maybe mixing that in. And then some three max, five max, but all really, really low dollar amounts to just try to maximize that. I went through a period where I would play the mini max a lot, which is like 50 cents a lineup, and you can max out to 150 lineups, and that pays out. Um, you know, I think it pays out like 5 grand or something like that, or maybe it's less. And it's $75, and then you can pay. Then you can really, people say, oh well, geez, if I had $5 million and I could pay 150 lineups in every tournament I went to, it's like no, don't take it from someone that's gone down that road quite a few times. It's not that simple. Um, it's not that simple because it's hard to manage all of them either. Because
Right.
if you're just plugging them all out into an optimizer, you also get into this situation where it's like, well, geez, I don't know that I necessarily like. It's really hard to go through 150 lineups and be like, I want this guy, I want this guy, I want this guy. It's a it's really difficult. But I think your approach might actually be better because you're thinking about this in a very different way. You've got a model that's weighing different projections, and I think that you could probably approach this in a way that's much more automated than what I was able to do.
Yeah. I mean, that leads back to showdowns again, like that same idea where it's automated. Like I can't, and swaps, like I can't do late swaps with what I've started down the road with. Like
Hmm.
if I have a late swap NBA contest, it's pretty difficult for me to lock in certain pieces and rerun the optimizer if things change late. So right now, for initially, I think I'm just avoiding things with late swap. Or
Hmm.
I do think there's a huge opportunity there. Like if you could build a simulator where it basically looks at what everyone else has played so far, you understand how much salary they have
Yeah.
left. You probably understand what players they probably likely have left. You could
Yes.
probably hedge your way into a lot of wins. I bet with a
Yes.
simulate.
Yes.
It probably wouldn't even have to be that complex, but like that's like step 20, and I'm like on
Yeah.
step one. So
Yeah.
same thing with other sports. I feel like there's probably a lot of edge in baseball. I feel like there's probably a lot of edge in like NASCAR, MMA. I think those are ones I could probably do well in. I do wonder about football. I do wonder about basketball. Those tend to be very tough edges, just understanding performance of players.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
yeah, I don't know. Do you do a lot of late swaps? And if you do, like, kind of, what is your approach there? Do you kind of sit and look what people are doing and try to hedge your way out of it, or do you just let it roll?
Well, you know what's tough, and I think what you said earlier, I couldn't agree with more. The thing that's great about late swap is like, let's take the NFL for example. Okay, so let's say you got the nuts. You think you have the nut stack, right? Because really, in football, for example, unless you're playing with a guy like Jalen Hurts that doesn't necessarily need help from a receiver, but let's say you have Burrow and he's the nut stack. He's going to have Chase and Hurst or one of the other pass catchers with him. So you've identified that. All right. Let's say he happens to be low owned. So now you're like, so now what I do in those situations is I try to think to myself, okay, well, I'm going to focus on all the lineups I have that have that stack in it, and then I'm going to build around them. Because when you build an entire portfolio of players for like a slate, you're thinking about, I think it's more like I want to evenly distribute my the players that I really like as much as I possibly can, as evenly as I can, right? To give me the most opportunities to win. But once the game's beginning, you have all of this information. I try to think to myself, all right, well, if I've identified a couple of areas where I really think I could make some noise, then I'll try to focus on those and do a late stack there. The problem is what you identify, which is okay. So you may have a sense of like what the team that's in the lead has, and you might be able to, figure out what that team has. But then if it's 10,000 entries, what about the 2,000 that are in the same boat?
Right.
If Burrow's 10% owned, it's a $10,000 tournament. There's 1,000 guys that are in the same boat, and they probably stack just like you did. So then it goes back to what you're saying. Like, how do I go through the 10,000 entries and figure out most likely where the leverage is now that it's already there? You could probably figure that out because most of the time the ownership nowadays is pretty good. So you could probably figure out there, but I just don't have the tools to like automate that in a way that'll give me enough information to do that on the fly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon once the games are getting ready to wind down.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone does really. Like, I haven't seen that as like and if it maybe they are, and they're just really quiet
And
about
we
it.
just don't know. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
you'd probably see it. Like, I don't know what the results look like, but you probably would see some weird stack changes. But the thing is, you
Hmm.
don't know. Like when you look at the results of what you can get from the lineups, they only show what they actually played at the end. Like,
Right,
yeah, so you don't know if
right.
they're just off the rails like
Yeah,
from the start. So you don't. It would be nice if they're like, this was a late change, or this was started after first lock or
yeah,
whatever. But yeah,
yeah, yeah, for sure,
yeah,
for sure. So, I think to kind of put a bow on today, 60 Minutes is on, the coverage has ended, so we're going to have the rest of this golf tournament tomorrow. Um, so that should be interesting. And then, of course, the first, well, I guess Farmers is probably the first big tournament of the season, but I would say Waste Management's even bigger than Farmers at this point.
What a funny
And
sponsor, by the way. And this, again, pardon my ignorance from someone that doesn't follow a lot of golf. How is like one of your biggest tournaments sponsored by Waste Management? Like, how does that?
dude, everyone's got to take a dump. Everyone's got to like dispose of their shit somewhere, right?
That's the thing. Everyone has to. I don't need a fucking commercial for it. You know what I mean? Like, I don't need someone. Like, do you need trash? Yes, everyone needs trash service.
Everyone does. Literally everyone.
It's not like I'm shopping for it either. Like in my town, I don't even get to pick. They just come and take it. Like it's not like I'm. Let me move my home to a town down the road which has their town dump service. Like this is not a decision I need to make where they need to be sponsoring a golf tournament. Sidebar. So
Sidebar. Yeah, it's a big tournament. It's a lot of fun. I've never been, but if you watch it on TV, it looks like a rip roar. It's like the closest thing you get to like an NFL game on a golf course or NBA kind of environment. And what's interesting about this week is because this tournament's ending on Monday, you already had a whole bunch of withdrawals for this tournament because there's a bunch of guys that are going to try to play on. Well, I don't even know if they're doing the qualifier tomorrow because there's usually a qualifier for these golf tournaments on Mondays. So I don't even know what's going on with that, but I would imagine that there's a lot of guys that are going to be playing to try to do that. Yeah, what's the qualifiers tomorrow? So we got a great golf tournament up ahead next weekend. So that will be fun. That'll be
our,
really interesting.
so our plan is to do a preview for that, right? We'll do a
Mhm.
preview before it starts. We'll put that out on Wednesday on our YouTube channel, which is Stream of Sweat on YouTube. We'll also have it on Twitch if that's where you're watching. And then we'll do another one on Super Bowl Sunday. We could do an hour long. Maybe Friday. Maybe Friday. We don't watch our Twitter, which is at Stream of Sweat on twitter.com, and we'll put out our schedule. But we'll definitely have a live stream Tuesday night, time TBD, and we'll do a sweat. We'll do a sweat either the Friday cut or we might do it Sunday, depending on my work schedule. So that'll be a fun time.
Indeed. Looking forward to it.
So please find us on social media. Thank you, Ngandu, for jumping on with me. I'm excited to do this with you. Long
Likewise.
time coming. So, yeah, we'll see you guys all again very soon. Thank you.
Peace.